For the closing panel, vadis Norway. Please welcome on stage the moderator, commentator in Dagens Næringsliv, Sverre Strandhagen.
Thank you. In our closing panel, we will focus on Norway. How does a small state cope in a world of unpredictability, great power competition, and disruptive forces? In our panel, we have 5 excellent experts to discuss this topic and help us with some answers. Please welcome Knut Hauge, former ambassador both in NATO and in Russia, and former Director General at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Eva B. Neumann, Director, Fridtjof Nansen Institute, also expert on Russia. Ulf Sverdrup, Professor at the Norwegian Business School and a former Director of the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. Janne Holland Matlari, Professor of International Politics, University of Oslo, and Norwegian National Defense University College. And the last one, Karsten Friis, Research Professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. First, before we start with the panel, I would just make a few points. One takeaway from yesterday is that very much is at stake, especially for Ukraine, of course, but also for Europe, for Norway included. And Europe should be ready, but Europe is not ready. And that means that there is a kind of struggle for a strategy to pleasing Mr. Trump. And Norway has even chosen Jens Stoltenberg as the Minister of Finance in order to please Mr. Trump. Second, much energy will be used on Trumpology, trying to figure out the next move by studying the position of different advisors and ministers and wings in the Republican Party. Third, I will read 2 quotes. There are times you have to be aggressive, but there are also times to lie back. A negotiation with a strong adversary, one must open aggressively, but then seek to crucial moment to settle. Was this Clausewitz, Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, or Julian Lindley French? No, it was of course Donald Trump. In his book, The Art of the Deal, this is the modus operandi of Mr. Trump. Maybe we should keep this in mind. My 4th point is what we heard yesterday from the Prime Minister of Norway. He talked about the Norwegian national security strategy that is coming in the spring. But he also mentioned that the Norwegian self-imposed restrictions in northern Norway may be modified. And that is quite interesting because, as you all know, that we have these kind of restrictions and we have troops on rotation and so on in order to calm down the Russians because they are so afraid of us up in the north because of what they have at Kola. This brings us back to our panel because this is one topic that we'll come back to. But now I turn to the panel and I would like, as we have done before, each of you to have 5 minutes short introduction And afterwards, we will have a discussion and some prepared questions. And I will start with you, Mr. Hauge. Knut, Trump says he wants to end the war in Ukraine. And he has already put pressure, at least in a tweet, on Mr. Putin. What are the dangers ahead? And how do you rate the possibility of a peace deal between Putin and Zelensky?
Well, to answer very shortly, I don't rate them very highly at all. I think the possibility of reaching a peace deal now is close to zero. And I think also that even a ceasefire might be possible, but it's not likely either. Listening to the debate, not only here, but in general, I feel myself from time to time a bit frustrated with the focus on Ukraine and on Mr. Trump. As if, I mean, the main issue here is the aggressive Putinism. It's Putin who is the aggressor. He started the war. And it's important to remember that this war didn't happen by chance. It was a war of choice. It is a war of choice. It grows naturally out of the development of Putinism in Russia. So the whole idea of re-establishing Russia as a great power, which has been, I mean, in a way, the headline of what Putin has been trying for the last 25 years, leads to this. This is, I mean, if anyone has any doubt, they could look back to the papers the Russians gave us in December 21, where it's clearly spelled out the ambitions Russia has for developing its role as a great power. And this is not about territory. It's not about, I mean, of course, it is that as well. I mean, because Putin has deliberately painted himself into a corner where he has annexed the areas of Ukraine. But it is about, in the short run at least, about the control of Ukraine. I mean, when we're banding about with ideas that we could have a moratorium on 10 or 20 or whatever years on Ukrainian NATO membership, of course, Putin will never go for that. The only true guarantee for Ukraine never joining NATO is Russian control over Ukraine. So, I mean, I am not able to detect any signs of willingness on part of the Putin regime to depart from its principal aims in this war. On the contrary, increasingly they have painted the conflict as an existential conflict with the West. I mean, Putin's messianic tendencies and the dictatorship has been more and more obvious during this time. And of course, on top of that, you have the transformation of the Russian economy, to put it mildly, and also the Russian society, the repression apparatus which is in place. The war is now an integral part of what is happening in Russia. So no, I do not believe a peace deal is, or a compromise is possible at this stage. So we will see what happens. I do not think that Trump or the United States can change this. I mean, although, of course, Trump says he wants a peace deal and so forth, it's not up to him to dictate this. US is powerful, but he can, of course, pull the rug from under Ukraine. This will not mean that Ukraine will stop fighting. Ukraine is in an existential fight to survive as a nation. They cannot afford not to fight. But he can try that way and give Putin what he asks for. That will mean that Mr. Trump will come across as a loser. It will be a situation which makes the withdrawal from Afghanistan seem like a big success. So we will see. So you can say that. I mean, my blunt message is that Putin must be stopped by force. He must be contained. So you can ask, what is the end state in Ukraine? I don't know. No one knows. I only know that what Putin now is doing in Ukraine and the whole ideology now underlying his aggression is so bad that it must be stopped. And then we will see how this will pan out. But I mean, we cannot afford, because we cannot answer the question what is the end state, not to stand up to this. The same, I mean, what kind of future for Russia, how do we envisage that? I mean, of course, this is not knowable either. I mean, we could have a breakdown tomorrow, no one knows. We could have many years before us with a steadily increasing aggressive fascist state developing in Russia. That is also possible. We don't know. So what we have to focus on, and that has been a theme going through this conference, is of course to build a credible deterrence, and I mean, to try to draw it a little bit across to the Norwegian side of this, to avoid visions detached from reality. This has been a challenge in Norwegian-Russian policy for many years, not only in Norway. I mean, my God, it's been all over the place. But I mean, the vision thing is dangerous, where we, in a way, presuppose that if we are nice to the Russians and we cooperate with them, they will automatically come over to our side. And I mean, I'm speaking here as a person who has spent more than 40 years working with and observing the Russians. So, you know, this is my life. So it is not with an easy heart I'm saying this, but I think really, I mean, we heard the Prime Minister yesterday repeat this slogan, high north, low tension. I think this is dangerous because it depicts a vision which is detached from reality. It should simply, we should leave that behind. We should leave that behind. So we should remember that the people who are now waging a genocidal war in Ukraine are exactly the same people who are deciding the policy towards us and the other Nordic or the rest of the world. I mean, there is no separate office in Moscow with people who are pondering how to be nice to Norwegians. So there are the same people. So deterrence, credible defense, and significant support for Ukraine. And as the Chief of Defense said, I mean, the new high hopes for the new Minister of Finance. Although, of course, his time might be limited to achieve 5%. We wish him all the best.
Okay. You finished? Thank you.
Yes, I could go on, but I mean, you want other people to join in as well.
I will continue with you, Iver. A peace settlement or not, what will be the best way of handling Putin's Russia for a small country like Norway? And what kind of, if any, cooperation and relations should Norway have towards Russia as long as Putin is a strong man? You have 5 minutes.
One answer has already been given, and I think it's a sound answer. It's always nice to start one's thinking from an historical base, not because there are sort of necessarily a lot of parallels as such, but because one gains a perspective that is at least not out of thin air. And I'm one of those who thinks that George Kennan's Long Telegram is one of the most incisive texts on Russia ever written. And he makes 2 points at the end there about what we should do. One of them is that we should do a deterrence job. That point has already been made. The other point is that we should sort of bring order to and maintain our own house, that we should hold high democratic standards and stand tall for those. Instead of starting to wither away in what is, after all, the default option in history, an authoritarian kind of regime. So that's one way to start. The other one is to say that someone must engage Russia in some way. You said that you'd been following Russia for 40 years. Well, there was a time when we had conversations there was a time when there was a West, and the West had a conversation with the Soviet Union on arms control, and nobody were in high hopes about actually getting sort of specific deals, but it was a place to engage. It was a place to talk. Right? And the talking cure is important. I mean, even if one is only able to converse in grunts, it's still a conversation. We must maintain that. I mean, at the present stage, we have one place where we do this on a regular basis. That would be how we maintain the debate about fisheries. We have the fisheries treaties that were sort of made in 74, 75. On a civil servant basis, we meet every year and have done so also after February 2022. That is a basis. Right? I see now that a number of the specific municipality-to-municipality ties that existed as a result of the Barents region in the north are dissipated. It's probably necessary, but it's a loss because those were small ties that could be used for larger issues. So maintaining the little we've got is very important. The deeper worry these days is, of course, that the number one rule in Norway was never end up with the Russians alone in the north. And how are we going to do that now? Only a couple of months ago, we had a not insignificant American ship coming and sailing along the coast. Very nice. Will we see that again in the near future? We have oil rigs in the North Sea, and we used to give it very little thought whether that would be a chip in the great power game. Can we take that for granted now? So my deepest concern now is that we have two options. One of them is to sort of make out that it's business as usual. We will follow the US, we will trust the US security guarantee. If we go down that road, we will have to say goodbye to the liberal world order, which is rather a pity. Kennan would not have liked it. If we stand up for the liberal world order, we know that this will inculcate all kinds of troubles with the American regime. We've seen this beginning to divide Norwegian discussions already over Palestine, with one side of the political spectrum saying that the Palestinians need a state to defend themselves against genocide. The other side being a bit divided on this. If we get the situation, which we may very well get, where the left of the political spectrum ends up trying to defend the liberal world order, and the other one decides to go with the US, that's the end of consensus in Norwegian foreign policy, and that's very bad. It would be better to find a modus vivendi between the two parties, and I hope to God that those discussions already are taking place in a formalized framework, but I think not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you. We will continue with you, Ulf. Mr. Trump, he tells the Europeans to take more responsibility for their own defense and for Ukraine. Do you think that the American pressure could lead to a stronger European pillar in NATO? And what can be a strategy for Norway?
Okay, it's a big topic. Now, I think that we have already seen over time that Europe has increased the defense spending. It's been a topic that we had to cover the whole conference. And actually, every year, during the last 10 years, the European spending in NATO has increased, and in this 10-year period, I think the US has increased their spending with around 20%, whereas the Europeans have increased their spending with close to 100%. Still, the Europeans, of course, spend less than the US. So, and I think Trump, the first Trump, contributed to add pressure on the Europe. But of course, the most important factor is not Trump, it's Putin and the sense of urgency in European countries. Since you asked me to prepare something, I put up 3 big issues that I think will be very important for the political conversation in Norway, but also in Europe as we go along. And the first is about the future target in spending. And the second is the issue of how to fund it. And the third is how to spend it. So on the targeting, I thought Erik Kristoffersen, the Chief of Defense, gave a very nice lecture, but I was a bit worried when he mentioned this 5% target. Because we are now in an environment where most countries have struggled to achieve 2%. The NATO Secretary General has said that, okay, we might increase it to 3%, and Trump has upped it to 5%. There will be a very intense discussion about what should be the target moving forward. What should that target be composed of? And I'm afraid that when Trump announced 5% target, it's a walkaway strategy from NATO. It's basically something that very few, if any country, can achieve it. Again, what will the implications be for Norway here? I think if you look at the NATO spending, you see the countries that are close to the Russian border tend to spend more, tend to be more willing to. So there will be a certain pressure for Norway, but we have to find a way of kind of finding an adequate measure that we can be able to stick to, as Knut said. So that's the first point. The second point relates to the funding. We have to recognize that European economies in general are not in very good shape. This is like 88% debt among EU countries. And also many European countries face aging societies, pressure for increasing welfare spending. So, and there's lots of requirements in the European public budget to increase competitiveness, reduce close innovation gap, transition to green economies, etc. So there's been massive competition for how to invest your money. So it's this trade-off between how much to invest in security, how much to invest in welfare. Obviously, Europeans have to find a better balance. And I think that for Norway, we are in a very difficult or a special situation. Compared to most European countries, we have more money. And that, of course, makes sure that we have a better availability and capability to invest in security, and also that others expect us to contribute more. And we can no longer assume that others don't know, because they know that we are rich. And you know, for decades, Norwegian politicians said we are so rich that 2% for the Norwegian economy amounts to so much money. We cannot afford the 2% because we're so rich. And that argument is not flying very well. So that would be very demanding. I should also say that I put up a warning here against just applauding Jens Stoltenberg as a Minister of Finance. Of course, that's a good choice. But remember, he is now entering a government building, Minister of Finance in Norway. And you know the saying in the Minister of Finance? Welcome. In this building, we say no before we say hey. We say nay before we say hey. Right? So there's a culture for, of course, being concerned about spending. And then the third part relates to how to spend it. And this is of course a very important question about should we run for the immediate resources that we can ready to take out from the shelf? Should we buy American gear, or should we try to develop something else? And here, there was this meeting yesterday in the EU, and where the French, in particular, would like to buy European. I think this was discussed also. And I think that, of course, we can have different concerns about the French here, but I think it's a basic taxpayer logic here, in a sense that if you want governments to commit to increase spending in security, you need to have some kind of return in jobs, in manufacturing capacity, and in particular because investments in defense and security will generate other kinds of innovation, technology, etc. So I think that this will be a big topic, and of course, my hunch is that the Norwegian position will be that not to say either American or Europe, but to try to support, let's say, integration of Western defense technologies. So I stop there.
Thank you, thank you. I turn to my left side, Janne. What kind of hedging strategy is available for Europe if President Trump continues to cast this uncertainty over US support for Ukraine and for NATO? And what about Norway? Could we be in a good position because we are an important supplier of intelligence and because we buy a lot of American military equipment?
Yes, I think we need to think strategically, although we're a small country. We're rather big geographically and economically, of course. This is a time for consolidation of Europe, clearly, because we face a risk from Trump, that is a political risk of trade war particularly, but also of withdrawing much support in NATO. I'll get to that in a moment. So that's the trade war risk which we have seen demonstrated, and is probably the negotiating tactic that you quoted. I have a domestic variant of that. My youngest daughter, who used to be called a terrorist at home, she would say, "Give me an ice cream now, and I will not start to scream." And that I usually quote as an illustration of Russian maximalism in negotiations, but it's probably also Trumpian maximalism. So we have to be prepared for that by having power, but also by being able to be tough. I think Trump respects toughness. He gets some toughness in return. So we face trade war threats, which immediately points to the EU as the safe haven, as the necessary safe haven, which I write today in my column in your paper, that it's urgent to get into the EU for safety reasons, for economic safety reasons also. But it also points to NATO, European NATO, for consolidation of, should one say, European pillar of NATO, if you will. And in NATO, certainly Trump has a very valid criticism. I was looking up the statistics. They are from NATO itself, spending on defense. And one graph here, which you can't probably see, but this is 2014. Crimea is annexed. How many states in NATO, not nations, but states, member states, reach 2%? 3. And then we are in 2024, we are 23 that reach 2%, but that still leaves 9. So it's rather dismal reading. And if you look at the spending targets on the graph that shows investment and percentage, you see that in this lower quadrant, very many countries spend, I would say, a lot on nice uniforms, on pensions, very little on investment. And I won't name them in case people feel offended, but there are quite many states in NATO that simply do not spend much on operational ability and equipment. So Trump is quite right on this. And it's in Norway and Europe's interest to have as much unitary action capability as possible, because not only do we face trade war, a threat of trade wars, a big political risk with Trump, but we also face war with capital W and war with small w. Hybrid warfare, we are in a political war with Russia and China in terms of various types of means that are non-military. Flights into Kirkenes are not only jammed but spoofed. That's a major incursion into our sovereignty, isn't it? So many examples of hybrid warfare. So we're in that war already. And then in addition, we do not know whether war with capital W might occur in Europe. That depends, I think, on the end game for Ukraine, which is absolutely uncertain. I think the consensus may be that on the militarily 9 to 12 months is the time span for victory or losing the war, unless there is a major Western change of, let's say, willingness to assist militarily to Ukraine, they will lose this war. And I don't see, as Knut Hauge underlined, I don't see very, very many signs of willingness in Europe to do much more, or willingness on the part of Trump. He has criticized the long-awaited acceptance by Biden for using ATACMS missiles in Russia, for instance. So what should Norway do? Norway should approach the EU as soon as possible. Now the Labour Party is alone in government and can advocate maybe for this. We should also look at our regional partners in NATO. It's no secret that NATO consists of 32 states, of which some are willing and able. And we are in the willing and able category in the north of Europe. British leadership, JEF, Nordic integration, all this is a wonderful story. It's a positive story in all the misery. But we should also look at the Defense Commission's proposal for a hedging strategy, which you mentioned, hedging, where they say, is it wise to be so dependent on the US and the Atlantic in these times? Shouldn't we have more of a hedging in terms of cooperation with the major European powers? And here we have it with Germany, certainly with Britain, which is the most important ally. We have very little with France, and France is a key leading state in both NATO and the EU, of obvious interest to Norway. So we should think about who are the close allies and for which reasons. This is a time to do that. Thucydides, this fellow from the Peloponnesian War, famously said that the mighty do as they wish and the small do as they must. And we are in the small category in this sense. But Julian Lindley French, who is a contemporary in the room, also famously said the European states only recognize as much threat as they can afford. And I think both are right. So we are in the fortunate position of being able to afford proper threat recognition. So we should be willing to spend more on defense. We should, in a way, think about the riches we have. I mean, if we're going to have these riches in the oil fund for future generations, that presupposes that Norway survives and thrives as a state. And we should understand that the risk of Trump as president is one that should be handled from a position of strength. We should not be alone with China, as we have tried for 4 years, and not a pleasant experience. We shouldn't be alone with Russia, as Russia always invites us to have a samboerskap, condominium. we should not be alone with the US. That's risky under this presidency. So I think on the EU side, Norway needs to take this very seriously now that there is safety in numbers and the current arrangement is not satisfactory. And perhaps it's possible with the current government being pro-EU membership, with Hauge being pro-EU membership, perhaps it's even possible in times of crisis to think of a grand coalition government for this country.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, we have long 5 minutes, but we have good thoughts. Please, Carsten, you finish?
Thank you. You invited me to talk a little bit about the Nordic. As the last speaker on the last panel the last day, I'm very pleased to see that some of you are still here, so thank you. I was a bit concerned, actually. Look, Sweden and Finland joining NATO. I mean, it's one good news coming out of this mystery of the war is actually that. And you remember how it was for Norway, Norwegian defense in NATO. We were basically an island. Right? The only way you could reinforce Norway was through air and ships. And you know, if you ever been to the northern Norway, want to go to Finnmark, you always drive through Finland because it's the fastest road, right? The military couldn't plan with that, right? Because they were not part of NATO. So I mean, this is fundamental when it comes to military planning, the practicalities of defending our territory. Having Sweden and Finland on board, it means so much from the very practical operational level to, of course, the political level. It's really, really a positive change. And although there are, I would say, there are two military challenges in our region. It's the Baltic question and it's the High North. They are not exactly the same. They're related, but not exactly the same. Right? So the High North is about the nuclear deterrent, the Russian nuclear weapons and all that. And the Baltic Sea is about defending Helsinki and Stockholm and sea lines of communication, and of course the Baltic states. Nonetheless, what we have been seeing since the last couple of years when it comes to especially Nordic integration, defense cooperation, is just fantastic. I mean, there's so much going on, it's difficult to keep track of it all. Especially on the air side, we heard a little bit about it, but I mean, you know, there's about integrating command and control, about using each other's airfields, it's about using training and exercising and education. But they also seen, like on the land side, they are thinking about how to organize our common troops on the northern part of the Scandinavian peninsula in a way that kind of disregard our national borders. You know, it's actually defense integration, it's not simply cooperation. So it's all hooray, you know, and it's such a bottom-up kind of, you know, incredible cooperation. And also, you know, things we don't hear about, like intelligence and special forces and logistics, I mean, it's also happening. So I must say, I was a bit puzzled what Jens Stoltenberg was supposed to add that's not already thought of in his committee, but maybe that's why he became Minister of Finance, to get away from that job he was supposed to do. Anyway, he doesn't have to do it anymore. Now, okay, so this is the good news, despite the horrible war. The question is, as we're discussing, what happens with Trump, what happened with the United States, will they remain interested in our part of the world? So let's begin with the positive side. Yes, they will remain interested in the High North, for the simple reason that the nuclear weapons there are not targeted at Norway or Europe, but at the United States. So for the United States, the High North is homeland defense. So irrespective of who is sitting in the White House, or Moscow for that matter, that will be an interesting for the United States. They will be interested in those weapons. That means that they will cooperate with Norway on intelligence collection as long as we deliver our share. That also means that they will have a deterrence posture like they have, for instance, with the regular visits of strategic bombers. That was introduced in the previous Trump administration, and I have no reason to think they shouldn't continue. The so-called bomber task force coming to Europe, not only to the north, but the whole Europe. So that I think is, like, again, good news. We will have some cooperation. So does that mean that our interests align? Not necessarily. Does it mean that they will defend Finnmark? Not necessarily. But there will be an element of US interest and understanding, at least, and hopefully, even in the worst case scenario, there will be you know, some interest from the US side to keep an eye on, let's say, the northern flank. Now, There are also the political side of things, which is getting a bit complicated, because what everybody keeps saying now with the United States, we should stay together. We should stick together in Europe. We should come up with a plan proactively for Ukraine. We should come up with a proactive engagement in Europe and how to improve European pillar of NATO. But then you have the Greenland event, yeah, whatever you want to call it. And then the question is, are we as united behind Denmark as we should be? Or are some countries staying low, keeping the distance because they don't want to get hurt in the same debacle that this Mette Frederiksen is facing? I've heard both. I heard certain countries are extremely reluctant to stand up very firmly and visibly together with Denmark in this. If this is an indication of how we react in Europe under pressure, it's not very promising. But again, it's early days. I think we shouldn't conclude on anything. We are 2 weeks in the presidency, and we don't know. We have to find our way how to deal with it. Another challenge is this dependence of the United States when it comes to military. We can say we can hedge politically, but we cannot hedge technologically, right? Because all our defense systems are so integrated. We heard the chief of defense here talking about having effects, not platforms. Well, all those effects are part of a network of sensors and platforms and different systems that work together to create this effect. All these systems are American. There's no alternative. There's no German alternative or French alternative to this. So we are in bed with the American military systems, in the foreseeable future. You can turn that as a negative thing, but because in theory they could kind of turn off our planes so we can't take off, to put it a bit bluntly. But you can also turn it to a positive thing. And that means that the United States will have to be engaged with what we do. They have to be, at least parts of the American apparatus, military apparatus, will have to be engaged with us because they will not completely abandon us. Although they don't like what's going on, they don't want to be engaged maybe in the future situation, they have to be somewhat involved because we are using their system. So I will end on that optimistic note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, gentlemen and lady, you are free to give comments to each other. Mr. Hauge, yes, please.
Yes, why shouldn't I start? I would very much like to associate myself with what Karsten now said about the relations with America. I have some experience from the last time we had the pleasure of having Mr. Trump as US president. And of course, there were scary moments. I mean, who will ever forget about the 2018 summit in NATO? I see other people in the audience who are nodding. It was a scary moment. But I mean, overall, as far as Norway is concerned, it went quite well. What we noticed from the side of the Foreign Office at the time was that what had traditionally been a quite broad agenda with the Americans narrowed down to just one thing, security policy and defense. Almost nothing else was of any interest. And that was, of course, a bit frustrating, but not very threatening. Of course, I realized that this time around it is different. I mean, it's a mature Trump we are meeting, and he has had time to ponder and to develop things. But still, I mean, we do not really know how this is going to pan out. So I find myself in absolute agreement with what you said. But since I have the word, just for a moment, a comment also to what Iver said about the need to keep talking to the Russians. And of course, I mean, as a former diplomat myself, I would, although I was a bit militant in my intervention here to start with, of course, I'm all for talking to people. And I'm definitely all for talking to the Russians as well, as long as there is something sensible to talk about. And I mean, as Norway, so that people should not be misinformed about this, of course, there are channels still towards the Russians. We have diplomatic contacts. We have necessary contacts also in the high north, where our interests are interlinked Something else would be highly irresponsible. So at a certain low level, it's possible, but at a higher level, when we are starting to think about something, approaching like the Helsinki process in the 1970s, we are far from it. I mean, we have to realize that. Today's Russia is something different than the Soviet Union was back in the day. The Soviet Union, for all its strangeness and aggressiveness and whatnot, was in the 70s a status quo power in Europe. They wanted to secure their positions in Europe. And on that basis, it was possible to construct the Helsinki process, leading to the CSE and the OSCE. Today, Russia is not a status quo power in Europe. It is the opposite.
Iber, you wanted to comment on this? Or?
Definitely. I think that analysis is absolutely acutely correct. And I don't think we should forget that if we think about the world in a 500-year perspective, the one place that didn't give in to Western supremacy, Western hegemony, Western colonialism was Russia. So every time they come back at us, although it may be inexplicable from our point of view, I mean, this war doesn't follow a rationality that we usually share, but it follows a very clear Russian trend, and we should keep that in mind. I still think we should talk. Those fishing stocks that we're talking about are on their way north, which means that they are moving around, they're making a different kind of position, and we should, in our little way, talk about that. But I wanted to take issue with something that Carsten said. Well, not take issue with, but you speculated about what's now going on in the EU with Mette Frederiksen. I mean, I think we should hark back here to Brexit. When Brexit was happening, the Brits ran around to all the European capitals in order to divide and conquer, which is their historical pattern, perfidious Albion, and they were cold-shouldered all along their route. So I'm in high hopes about Mette Frederiksen and support. The fact that the Nordic heads of state came together for a dinner at her pad in the midst of pretty hairy situations at home gives me hope, which is one of the things that I rather like to have. And then I would like to end by sort of sharing Janne's comments on the European Union. A small country has to collaborate with someone, and who else is there than the EU? So that's a no-brainer. But in order to do that, we have to have a proper domestic conversation about this. And the situation is the opposite. When I look at how the breach in government has been handled, I see two parties that do not share the same kind of reality on what Europe is about. I mean, this thing has divided Norwegian politics at least since 1960, well, 60. And it will continue to do so. And again, we need that conversation. I think we have an expanded committee for foreign policy and defense in this country. I hope to God they're busy.
Thank you. Ulf, would you continue?
Yeah, on the Europe thing. So I think last week was quite significant. You remember, we've had several governments have had difficulty to come together, or they have been split on EU affairs. But it was quite significant that last week it's the first time a government broke on EEA platform. And that is, I think, and at least in my understanding, one of the reasons why Norway has not joined the EU is because the EEA platform has been a kind of solid compromise that one could negotiate on. And if this compromise is removed, I think that we are entering into a new landscape also on the conversation about Europe in Norway. So, but I wanted to bring up another topic that Eva brought up from this long telegram about the quality of the institutions, etc. We have I think it's just extremely important that we move the conversation about security to not only be about military security, but also building societal resilience. And whole of government has a role to play, private sector has a role to play, and when we talk about Russia, it's very much about territorial defense. Are we talking about China? It's about a much more complex picture about integration of value chain, etc. And I'm saying this because we are sitting in this beautiful room. And some of you might know this, but these paintings by Edvard Munch, they are not murals, they are canvases. And of course the Nazis, they had designated Edvard Munch as one of the degenerated art, entitled Kunst. So, but the head of the chief the chief for protecting the art in Norway, in April 1940, he was very clever. Hauge, he came down here, and together with some of his colleagues, they cut down all these pictures, rolled them together because they thought that the Nazis would burn them. And put them down in some mines, and then after all, we are fortunate enough to see them now. And this is about, and this is a kind of link to you, even in the sense that, okay, what is it that we want to protect? It's not only our territory, it's our values, it's our culture, it's belief in enlightenment and all these things. So, and I think that if we can mobilize those resources in society, much beyond kind of military defense, we will build much stronger societies.
Great. Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah, you wanted to give a comment, Janne.
Yes. One comment is really, you mentioned perhaps Denmark didn't get as much support. I think this was played by ear, what is wise to signal or not. Let's wait and see. But it's true that if you're in the EU, you have colleagues, you have the EU will have statements on foreign policy issues, especially economic foreign policy issues. So Denmark is in a better position than what was the case with us in 2010 with China. There was not much support from anybody for those 4 years, and that underlines how alone one is as a small country. And I think trade war threats now puts us directly, immediately between a rock and a hard place, because trade tariffs from the EU may harm us directly, and also American tariffs may harm us directly. So this is a new situation brought on by Trump and his fondness for tariffs. You know, in Sweden, toll is tull. You know, the Swedish word for toll is tull, and we think it is tull in a Norwegian sense too, but he doesn't. So this, and this is also, I think, in a way fortunate, because it signals the need for a national debate on not only trade wars, but also the fact that the EU's importance has grown in security and defense matters, as anything but military deterrence belongs to the EU's portfolio. And the NATO has more than enough in creating proper military deterrence. On the dependency of military dependency on the US, when you look at the spending on defense and see the US is 75% of NATO's total budget, and the capacities, we remember the Libyan war, how we needed low-flying helicopters, intelligence, ISTAR, all of this. Isn't this dependence also a reason why we should rethink it? On the evacuation, leaving Afghanistan, it was only the French who had their own intelligence and were able to leave prior to the Americans. We were all dependent on the Americans, and we in fact left with the Americans. There is, I think, it's a question of European NATO states must ask themselves, what capacities do we now lack? How can we procure them? And we also must face this question of, shouldn't we have our own armaments industry to a much greater extent, so as to be able to produce and to be self-dependent? And this, of course, is about strategic autonomy, and it's the sort of course, de Gaulle was quite adamant many decades ago about the importance of strategic autonomy, but it is a real question. And from this, if it is negotiations from strength is much more preferable than negotiations from dependencies. So here are some tough questions that Europeans must face. And in NATO, we have regions that work very well together and get integrated very well together. Nordics, UK, Netherlands, now Poland as a major military power, a rising power, Baltics. This gives possibilities that must be developed, I think. And Norway should be a key actor in NATO, as we are, but also recognize that much of the discussion of deterrence, resilience, trade wars, whatever security broadly defined, goes on in the EU, both in Brussels, both the same people meeting back to back or wall to wall or whatever. And we are not in this, you know, we're in half of it, not all of it.
Thank you. Karsten, you can comment on this if you want, but I have also a question. This talk about the national security strategy for Norway, do you have any, is this important for little Norway? We know, of course, that UK, US, Germany have this kind of strategy, national strategy, but do Norway need one?
It's only important if it's being used for something. If it's a document that will end up in a drawer, it's a waste of time. So if this is a strategy in its proper term, you know, so that the resources follow the strategy, or you know, something follows from it. It's just not a vision, a document with, you know, nice words. And I have no idea if there will be, you know, positive implications. The Defense Committee suggested, you know, there should be such a national defense strategy, and they also suggested that something should happen at a strategic level in Norway when it comes to handling crisis, RSU and other things. And for those who are Norwegian, so you know, we are extremely bad rigged for crisis management in Norway, in my view. One thing is like the big situation of a war situation. I mean, from 0 to 1, that, okay, we can handle that. We have systems for that. But it's everything hybrid, everything before that. Like the situation we are in right now, when it's not a crisis as such, but it's just an ongoing, you know, stream of new challenges all the time that requires strategic coordination. So one day Chinese want to buy a harbor. The next day somebody is sending a drone. The next day some incident. And if this is not addressed strategically, you know, we will just run around after all the events. And that's where we are now. Norway is not. We're still largely in deep peace, in my view, at least the way we are rigged, or you know, in our state structure. There is an awareness, growing awareness, that we should, you know, be more concerned about, you know, Chinese investments and all, and Russian activity and all that. But we're still far away from that. And if I can then segue into another point I wanted to build on what Janne was saying, because we heard this conference that we know one thing from Trump. He wants us to spend more on defense. If it's 3% or 5%, I mean, more than today. United States spends like 3.3 or something. Yeah, look at you, Jim. Is it something like that? So they're not even on 5. So, I mean, that's our hope, right? Anyway, spending more. Okay, fine. Let's say you agree on that. It will not have any impact tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. It takes a long time. My concern is that Donald Trump doesn't have that patience to see, oh, in 2030 we will spend, you know, 3%. He wants something now. And the question is, do we have European leaders that can get the act together and come up with that reply proactively? As we said, I mean, fortunately, not all countries in Europe have decided, like Norway, to sit on their own in their own house. They have come together and created a club where they can actually discuss these things and come up with a plan. And some of us think we should join that club. But still, that club, European Union, hasn't historically been very good at developing this kind of strategy. But I really hope now, after the German elections, that you get the Berlin-Paris axis going. Because I think if you get that one back, Poland is ready, UK is ready, the Nordics are ready, but we still think, I think, need that kind of engine in Europe. And again, if we could be optimistic, after German elections, if it goes well, maybe we'll get some, vitalized European strategic thinking, inshallah.
Thank you, thank you. The time is running very fast. Now we can allow some questions from our guests. Yes, Edward Lucas.
Yes, Edward Lucas. I just want to pick up a little bit on this idea that our problems started with Putin. This is a very common misapprehension in countries that weren't perhaps paying full attention in the 1990s. Actually, the Baltic states were warning us about this right back in the early 90s, about the Soviet nostalgia, Russian imperialism, the idea of ethnic Russians as a political category. And I think it may not have affected us then, but to be honest about it, we can't personalize this and say we have a Putin problem. We actually have a Russia problem.
Anyone?
This is absolutely correct, and thank you for pointing this out. It's, of course, not connected to President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin himself. That is a very good point. It is a Russia problem, I mean, the whole war against Ukraine is basically, it springs, that was my point, out of the development in Russia. That is absolutely true. Now, of course, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin happens to be the dictator of that country, so he must take some of the blame. But you're absolutely right in pointing this out.
Short one, even.
Yeah.
Yes.
The corollary of that is that if Putin left us tomorrow, these things would not necessarily look very differently. Because the patron-client system now in place and the militarization now in place are such that this kind of regime will last for some time, and we'd better bear that in mind.
Add one just.
Okay.
Well, I'm not a Russia scholar at all, so I'm there commenting on it. Nonetheless, I mean, we shouldn't essentialize Russians as evil, they cannot change, right? So our long-term strategy for Russia should be that one day it will become a normal country, right? It's not, because if you essentialize Russians as evil bastards, we'll never get out of it. And I'm sure Eva agrees with me with that.
Absolutely. I was talking about the regime. Yep. Let me quote a fellow Russianist, Sergei Medvedev, who says that my country commits suicide once a generation.
Another question? Yes, Jim Townsend.
I'm Jim Townsend, and so I know some of you in the audience, but let me say that I've worked with Norway and with Sweden since 1990 from the Pentagon, when I was the Norway Scandinavia desk officer there. 1990. I can't do the math, but that was a long time ago. So, and I still work year after year after year with your countries and with Europe and with NATO. I say that because I want you to know that what has been said up here and the relationship that the US and the Scandinavian nations and Norway, that what we've had, I know that, and I know the feelings that I'm hearing up here. And I think probably more than any other American citizen, I need to convey to you a couple of things. One is that Donald Trump is not the United States of America. Donald Trump, he's not representing all the Americans. It seems like it. It seems like it to me, too. I live in Washington. I have to live with what's happening there. It seems like he is, taking up residence in our minds here and occupying and making us think when he says things that represents everyone. That's just not true. And so as we talk about what Trump is going to do, and we're making big decisions and thinking about things on a big moment here based on what this one man is saying. Yes, he's the President of the United States, but there is a lot of people in the United States and in the US government right now, in the military and the civil society, that don't agree with this at all. So it's only 2 weeks, and there has been a lot done, and it is frightening to us too. But I think we have to keep our perspective. Our perspective is that the relationship between the United States and Norway is very close. That US Navy ship that went up the coast, it'll be back. The Marines that exercise in Norway, they're going to come again. Yeah. You know, we're going to be doing all of these things continually. Donald Trump doesn't wake up in the morning and think about not sending that Navy ship up. He's thinking about other things. But the great bulk of Washington and the great bulk of the work that's being done is going to continue along a trajectory that we have been on. It's going to continue there. And so we're 2 weeks in, and what we have to do is maintain our perspective and understand the strength and the history between the relationship of Norway and the other nations here, and Europe and the United States. It's very strong, and it's going to long last beyond Trump. So I just felt I needed to say that to you all, and to say let's hang together, let's be strong together, and we're going to make it through this time. So, not a question, just a comment.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Just wait a second. Janne wants a short reply.
Yes, you know, I spent 4 years as a student in the States, and we all love America. So it's, I think we agree completely, but I think what we need to do in Europe, in NATO Europe, regardless of who is president in the US, is to spend much more, take much more responsibility, develop as much unitary action capability as possible. And this is long overdue. So maybe, and Trump is right in his criticism of the European allies, I must say. So this is, on the security side, you know, he kicks us, it's a kickstart again, which we need. On the trade war stuff and all these things that are problematic, it's another matter.
I agree with that. I do agree.
Yes. Okay, another question, please.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, a question to the panel that follows up on this and mirrors the question about Russia, because what I would be interested in hearing from you is whether it is part of the Norwegian analysis that we might indeed have an American problem and not just a Trump problem, not because we're essentializing Americans as evil or anything, but just in light of the Pacific pivot, in light of perhaps potential economic downturns in the United States and so on. So to what extent is this Trump, and to what extent is it also sort of deeper developments in the United States?
Evert, yes, please.
Well, I don't think it has been lost on anyone that there's been a turn towards China, and I don't think it has been lost on anyone that in a bipolar world order, which we now have, there will be an overlay whereby any regional theater will have to relate to the US-China axis. Then there is a debate about how weak the US has become. I think my guess, I don't say prediction, I say my guess, would be that we will find out in this trade war that Trump's team, and he is the elected president of the United States, if memory serves, with actually an absolute majority of votes for once, he will find out that this is not the US of the 70s, that the US is significantly weakened. And of course, as seen from our neck of the woods, this is a challenge, but it's not a surprise. We've seen this happening over the decades. So,
thank you. We have just 2 minutes left. So, Ulf, you have half a minute.
Okay, so I don't think there's a calculus that US is declining, but what we observe, it picks up to the panel that you attended yesterday about the kind of US maybe rethinking its role in the world, and Norway has benefited a lot from this globalization, open markets, liberal world, and we now have to think about how to position ourselves in this new world. And I think this is a process that's ongoing, and part of that will probably, of course, also be our ties with the EU. Not because we don't want the US to be strong, but in order to actually maintain a strong transatlantic relationship, it might be good to also build a stronger European pillar component to it. But could I just add one point just to clarify? Is that as Norway is a huge investor country. So we have a huge sovereign wealth fund, and around 60% of that fund is invested in Northern America. So in that sense, we have never before in our history put such a great bet on the future prospect of the US. And it is very important for the future welfare of Norway.
Great. I think that was a good sum up, because now our time is out. So I ask the audience to give a big hand for this panel. Thank you very much.
I would very much like to thank the whole panel, of course, and Sverre for doing a very great job for moderating it. It's been fascinating to listen to you. And of course, we have challenges ahead. But I hope also to the audience who have followed us these 2 days that you have got a lot of new food for thought, that you are a little bit wiser, and that you have also questions you want to have answer on in the future. I would like my little crew to come up and join me on the stage. Camilla, Maja, and Anders. This is the Norwegian Atlantic Committee. And we will keep you busy debating, discussing, and taking care, engaging for our democracy in the years to come. We have a lunch in Domus Biblioteka in the end.